Jerome Williams signed the prenuptial agreement with a knowing smile, while his wife Simone basked in her own perceived cleverness. She believed she had successfully protected her million-dollar spa business empire from any unworthy risks or claims. Jerome simply observed in silence, his eyes sparkling with something Simone couldn't quite decipher. The secret phone calls, the hidden letters, and Jerome's surprisingly easy compliance with signing the contract all concealed a truth that would completely transform their lives. What would happen when Simone discovered that the contract she was so proud of might mean absolutely nothing at all? Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications if you can. If you're excited for the next part, hit like and tell me where you're watching from, Atlanta, Cleveland, or maybe Ohio. Now let's dive into Jerome's hidden world. The evening shadows stretched across the mahogany dining table as Simone Williams placed the thick legal document in front of her husband with the satisfaction of someone who had just executed a brilliant strategic move. Her perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the polished wood as she watched Jerome's reaction, expecting surprise, maybe even resistance. Instead, he simply picked up the gold-plated pen she had positioned beside the papers and began reading with an expression that seemed almost amused. The grandfather clock in their spacious Atlanta suburb home ticked steadily, marking each second of what Simone believed would be a difficult conversation. She had rehearsed her arguments for weeks, prepared counterpoints for every objection he might raise about protecting her thriving chain of luxury spas. But Jerome's calm demeanor was throwing her completely off script. "A prenuptial agreement," Jerome said quietly, his deep voice carrying none of the tension Simone had anticipated. At 42, he possessed a quiet confidence that had initially attracted her, though she sometimes wished he would show more emotion, more fight. His architectural training had taught him to read blueprints with precision, and he applied the same methodical approach to the legal document before him. After 3 years of marriage, you want to formalize financial boundaries. He looked up at her with those penetrating brown eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed, and Simone felt a flutter of uncertainty she quickly suppressed. She had built her business empire through decisive action and clear thinking, not second-guessing herself when she knew what needed to be done. Simone straightened in her chair, her silk blouse catching the light from the crystal chandelier above them. At 38, she had worked tirelessly to build Serenity Spa Solutions from a single location into a chain of 5 high-end wellness centers that catered to Atlanta's affluent clientele. The prenup would protect what she had built, ensuring that her assets remained untouchable regardless of what happened in their marriage. "The business has grown significantly," she explained, her tone businesslike despite the intimate setting. "My lawyers recommended protecting both our interests clearly. This way there's no confusion about what belongs to whom." She gestured toward the papers with the confidence of someone accustomed to making executive decisions. "It's just smart financial planning, Jerome. Nothing personal." Jerome nodded slowly, continuing to read through each clause with surprising thoroughness for someone she expected to skim and sign. His fingers traced the legal language as if he were reviewing architectural specifications for a major project, and Simone found herself growing impatient with his deliberate pace. She had imagined this conversation would involve more discussion, perhaps some negotiation, but his methodical silence was somehow more unsettling than any argument would have been. The house around them felt unusually quiet, as if even the walls were holding their breath for his response. Through the large windows, she could see the sprawling grounds that came with the historic property Jerome had somehow secured for them 3 years ago, though she had never fully understood how he had managed to afford such a place on his architect's salary. "You're protecting your spa business," Jerome observed, his tone remaining neutral as he reached the final pages. "All assets acquired before and during the marriage remain with their respective owners." Very comprehensive. He set the document down and looked at her directly, and for a moment Simone thought she saw something flicker in his expression. Amusement, perhaps, or irony, but it passed so quickly she might have imagined it. "I assume you've had your attorneys review this thoroughly." His calm acceptance was beginning to unnerve her more than she cared to admit. She had been prepared for resistance, for questions about trust and commitment, for the kind of emotional discussion that would require all her persuasive skills. Instead, he was treating it like any other business transaction. "Of course I have," Simone replied, though she found herself defensive about his easy compliance. "This protects both of us, Jerome. If something ever happened to our marriage, we'd both walk away with what we brought into it." She paused, studying his face for any sign of the hurt or anger she had expected. I worked hard to build my business. I just want to make sure it's secure. The words felt hollow as she spoke them, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Perhaps it was the way Jerome was looking at her, as if he understood something she didn't. Or maybe it was the nagging feeling that she was missing some crucial piece of information. But she pushed those doubts aside, focusing instead on the practical necessity of the document before them. Jerome reached for the pen with the same deliberate motion he used when signing blueprints, his signature flowing across the page in confident strokes. The ease of it startled Simone, who had spent sleepless nights anticipating this confrontation. There, he said simply, sliding the signed document back toward her. Your assets are protected. The way he said it carried an undertone she couldn't quite interpret, as if there were layers of meaning beneath his words that she wasn't privy to. His phone buzzed on the table beside him, and she noticed him glance at it with an expression of recognition before declining the call. It was the third time this week she had observed him ignoring calls from the same unknown number, and the pattern was beginning to bother her more than she wanted to admit. As Simone gathered the papers with trembling hands, she realized this victory felt nothing like she had imagined it would. Jerome's compliance should have been reassuring, proof that their marriage could weather practical decisions without emotional drama. Instead, she felt as if she had just completed a puzzle only to discover that several pieces were still missing. The way he had read every word so carefully, the slight smile that had played at the corners of his mouth, the mysterious phone calls he kept deflecting, all of it suggested that Jerome knew something she didn't. But what could her husband possibly be hiding that would make him so unconcerned about protecting his financial interests? As they sat in the elegant dining room of their beautiful home, Simone couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a terrible miscalculation. The memory hit Jerome like a sudden rain shower as he stood in his home office the next morning, watching Simone's car disappear down the tree-lined driveway toward her flagship spa location. 25 years ago, he had been 17 and standing in this very same room, though it had looked vastly different then: sparse furniture, dusty corners, and the lingering scent of his grandfather's pipe tobacco. Ezra Williams had been a man who commanded respect without ever raising his voice, a successful businessman who had quietly accumulated vast holdings in real estate and timber, while most people saw only a reserved black man who kept to himself. Control your emotions, boy, Ezra had said that final summer before Jerome left for college, his weathered hands steady as he poured coffee from a silver service that seemed incongruous with his simple clothing. Watch, listen. Learn what people reveal about themselves when they think nobody's paying attention. Jerome had carried that lesson through architecture school, through his early career, and into his marriage, though he had never imagined it would become so relevant to his personal life. The phone rang precisely at 9 o'clock, just as it had every Tuesday for the past 6 months, and Jerome recognized the caller immediately. Harold Pemberton's voice carried the careful diction of a man who had spent 40 years navigating delicate legal matters for wealthy clients who valued discretion above all else. Good morning, Mr. Williams. I trust you've had time to consider the final documentation we discussed. Jerome settled into the leather chair that had once been his grandfather's, running his fingers along the worn armrests as he processed the lawyer's words. The inheritance had been finalized 3 weeks ago, though the process had begun the day he turned 42, exactly as Ezra had specified in his will. 500 acres of prime Georgia land, the historic mansion Simone believed they were renting, and $15 million in carefully managed investments that had grown steadily since his grandfather's death 15 years earlier. Everything is in order, Jerome replied, his voice measured and calm, despite the magnitude of what they were discussing. The irony wasn't lost on him that Simone had chosen yesterday to present her prenuptial agreement, determined to protect assets that paled in comparison to what he had just inherited. But Ezra's influence extended even from the grave, and Jerome found himself following the old man's philosophy of careful observation. I'll need some time to decide how to proceed with disclosure, he continued, knowing that Harold understood the delicate nature of the situation. His marriage had been built on mutual respect and shared goals, but he was beginning to question whether Simone's love extended beyond the comfortable lifestyle he had somehow provided. The timing of her prenup, coming so soon after her business expansion, felt uncomfortably calculated. Jerome ended the call and walked to the window that overlooked the gardens his grandfather had designed decades earlier. Ezra Williams had been a man ahead of his time, quietly amassing wealth while facing the subtle and sometimes overt discrimination that had defined much of his era. He had taught Jerome that true power came from patience, from allowing others to reveal their intentions before showing your own hand. Money changes people, Ezra had warned during one of their many conversations about life and relationships. Some it corrupts, others it reveals. The wise man learns to tell the difference. Jerome had thought he understood his grandfather's meaning then, but watching Simone's recent behavior, the increased focus on business expansion, the casual comments about their comfortable arrangement, and now the prenup had given those words new significance. Footsteps in the hallway interrupted his thoughts, and Jerome quickly moved away from the window as Simone appeared in the doorway. She had returned from her morning spa visit earlier than usual, her expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who had solved a complex problem. "I wanted to thank you again for yesterday," she said, though something in her tone suggested she was still processing his easy compliance with her request. "I know some men would have taken the prenup personally, but you understand this is just business." Jerome nodded non-committally, noting how she framed their marriage in commercial terms without seeming to realize it. Her phone buzzed with what appeared to be a text from her business manager, and she glanced at it with the immediate attention she reserved for spa-related matters. "Harold called," Jerome said simply, testing her reaction to the name she had heard him mention occasionally but never questioned deeply. Simone looked up from her phone with polite interest but no real curiosity, and Jerome realized that her lack of genuine engagement in his life had become so normalized he had stopped noticing it. "Family business," he added, which was technically true even if it drastically understated the situation. She nodded absently, already turning her attention back to her phone, and Jerome felt a familiar pang of disappointment. When had they stopped being genuinely interested in each other's lives? When had their conversations become exchanges of necessary information rather than intimate sharing between partners who cared deeply about each other's experiences and concerns? "That's nice, honey," Simone replied automatically, scrolling through what appeared to be financial projections for her spa expansion. "I've got 3 client consultations this afternoon, so I'll be late getting home. There's leftover casserole in the refrigerator if you want to heat it up for dinner." The casual dismissal in her voice stung more than Jerome had expected, confirming what he had begun to suspect about the true nature of their relationship. She saw him as a steady, reliable presence who provided emotional and financial stability while she pursued her ambitious business goals. But did she see him as a partner, as someone whose inner life mattered to her, or had he become simply a comfortable arrangement that allowed her to focus on what really excited her? The prenup had answered that question more clearly than any direct conversation ever could have. As Simone gathered her things and headed back toward the door, Jerome made a decision that would have made his grandfather proud. He would continue watching and learning, allowing the situation to develop naturally while he determined what kind of woman he had really married. The inheritance gave him options he hadn't possessed before, but more importantly, it had revealed truths about his marriage that might have remained hidden forever. Ezra's voice seemed to whisper from memory, "Patience, boy. The truth always reveals itself to those wise enough to wait for it." Jerome settled back into the grandfather's chair, understanding for the first time why Ezra had insisted that wisdom came not from rushing into action, but from having the strength to observe until the right moment presented itself. The phone rang again, but this time Jerome let it go to voicemail, knowing that some conversations required perfect timing to achieve their intended effect. The business card felt crisp between Simone's fingers as she sat in her car outside Marcus Investigations, a discreet office tucked between a coffee shop and a boutique law firm in downtown Atlanta's financial district. 3 weeks had passed since Jerome signed the prenup with that unsettling ease, and his behavior had only become more puzzling. The mysterious phone calls continued, always taken in private, always ending with him looking thoughtful in a way that suggested significant matters were being discussed. Yesterday, she had discovered a bank statement that had fallen behind his desk, an account at a different institution than their joint checking, with balances that made no sense given his architectural salary. Marcus Thompson had come highly recommended by her attorney as someone who specialized in financial investigations with absolute discretion. "Mrs. Williams, I appreciate you coming in," Marcus said as he led her into his modest office, where certificates and commendations lined the walls alongside photos of him in military uniform. He was a compact man in his 50s with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations. Before we discuss your concerns, I want to be clear about what this type of investigation entails. Simone appreciated his straightforward manner. She had built her spa business by working with people who understood that she valued competence and results over personality. Marcus Thompson appeared to be exactly that type of professional. She needed to understand what her husband was hiding from her. I need to know if my husband is having an affair or involved in any financial impropriety, Simone stated directly, placing the bank statement copy on his desk. Jerome's been receiving calls he won't discuss. He has accounts I didn't know about, and he signed a prenuptial agreement without any resistance whatsoever. As she spoke the words aloud, she realized how paranoid they sounded. But the alternative was ignoring red flags that could devastate everything she had worked to build. Her business required her to read people accurately, and those same instincts were telling her that something significant was happening beneath the surface of her marriage. Markey reviewed the bank statement with professional attention, making notes in a leather-bound folder. This shows regular deposits from a law firm, Pemberton Associates. That's a high-end estate planning practice that typically handles wealthy clients. He looked up at her with an expression that suggested he had seen similar cases before. The amounts are substantial, but not irregular for someone dealing with trust or inheritance matters. Have you asked your husband directly about these transactions? Simone shook her head, feeling simultaneously embarrassed and vindicated. She prided herself on direct communication in business, but something about Jerome's recent demeanor had made her hesitant to confront him openly. He's become evasive, she admitted, hating how vulnerable the words made her feel. We used to share everything, but lately he deflects personal questions and seems to be living in his own private world. The admission stung because it forced her to acknowledge how distant they had become, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly when the change had begun. Perhaps it had been gradual, a slow drift that neither of them had noticed until the space between them had become too wide to bridge with casual conversation. Marcus nodded with the understanding of someone who had guided many clients through the painful process of discovering uncomfortable truths about people they loved. Meanwhile, Jerome was becoming increasingly aware that something had shifted in Simone's behavior toward him. She had always been observant, a quality that made her exceptional at reading her spa clients' needs. But lately, her attention felt more like surveillance than affection. He caught her watching him during phone calls, and she had begun asking casual questions about his daily activities that felt like gentle interrogation rather than spousal interest. The realization that she might be investigating him brought a mixture of disappointment and ironic amusement. If she had simply asked about the calls or the legal meetings, he might have found a way to explain without revealing everything. The confrontation came on a rainy Thursday evening when Simone arrived home to find Jerome reading in the study, the same room where his grandfather had taught him about patience and observation. She stood in the doorway with an expression that mixed determination with accusation, and Jerome realized that whatever investigation she had initiated was beginning to yield results. "We need to talk," she said, her voice carrying the tone she used when delivering difficult news to employees or clients. "I know you're hiding something from me, Jerome, and I'm tired of pretending everything is normal between us." The directness was vintage Simone, but the underlying anger was new. "What exactly do you think I'm hiding?" Jerome asked quietly, closing his book and giving her his full attention. He could see the internal struggle in her expression, the conflict between her desire for answers and her fear of what those answers might reveal. "You've been watching me, questioning me, treating me like a suspect rather than your husband. If you have specific concerns, perhaps you should voice them directly instead of conducting some kind of covert investigation." The words came out more sharply than he had intended, but her suspicious behavior had been eating away at his patience for weeks. Simone's composure cracked slightly, revealing the uncertainty beneath her confident facade. "You have bank accounts I've never heard of. You take calls you won't discuss, and you agreed to a prenup like it was meaningless," she said, her voice rising with each point. "Either you're planning to leave me, you're having an affair, or you're involved in something that could destroy everything I've built." The raw fear in her voice made Jerome realize how much her business success meant to her, but it also confirmed his growing suspicion that she saw their marriage primarily as a threat or benefit to her professional goals. "And rather than ask me directly, you chose to hire someone to investigate me," Jerome replied, watching her face confirm his suspicion before she could deny it. The hurt in his voice was genuine. Despite their recent distance, he hadn't expected her to treat him like a criminal rather than approaching him as a partner facing a difficult conversation. That tells me everything I need to know about what our marriage has become, Simone. We're not partners anymore. We're two people protecting our separate interests while sharing a house. The words hung in the air between them, and Jerome could see that his calm assessment was more devastating to her than any angry outburst would have been. The polished mahogany conference table reflected the morning light streaming through Harold Pemberton's corner office windows, casting geometric patterns across legal documents that would fundamentally alter Jerome's life. At 72, Harold possessed the distinguished bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades managing the affairs of Georgia's wealthiest families. His silver hair and tailored suit projecting the quiet authority that came with handling billions in inherited assets. The final inheritance papers lay before them like a roadmap to a future Jerome hadn't fully comprehended until this moment. Each signature and seal representing his grandfather's careful planning across decades of strategic accumulation. Your grandfather was quite specific about the timing, Harold explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed the documents one final time. The inheritance becomes fully active on your 42nd birthday, contingent upon what he called your demonstrated maturity and wisdom. Jerome studied the property deeds with the same methodical attention he brought to architectural blueprints, though the scale of what he was inheriting dwarfed any project he had ever conceived. 500 acres of prime Georgia land, including the historic mansion where he and Simone had lived for 3 years, $15 million in diversified investments, and mineral rights that had been generating steady income since the 1960s. He owned the house outright, Jerome said, the irony settling over him like morning fog. Simone has been living in my inheritance, worrying about protecting her assets from me, while I already owned everything she thought she was safeguarding. Harold nodded with the patient understanding of someone who had witnessed many similar revelations, though few quite as complex as the situation Jerome now faced with his marriage. Ezra was very deliberate about concealing his wealth, Harold continued, opening a sealed envelope that bore Jerome's name in his grandfather's distinctive handwriting. He believed that knowledge of significant assets changed people's behavior, often in ways that revealed their true character rather than their public persona. The letter inside contained Ezra's final thoughts about money, relationships, and the responsibility that came with inherited wealth. His grandfather's words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Money amplifies what people already are, Jerome. It doesn't create greed or generosity, but it reveals which tendency was always stronger. Watch how people treat you when they believe you have nothing, because that shows you who they really are. The advice felt uncomfortably relevant to his current marital situation. Jerome folded the letter carefully, understanding for the first time why his grandfather had insisted on such elaborate timing and secrecy. The prenuptial agreement Simone insisted I sign last month, he said slowly, working through the implications. It's designed to protect her assets from mine, but she has no idea what my actual financial situation is. Harold's expression remained professionally neutral, though Jerome detected a flicker of sympathy in the older man's eyes. Indeed, Harold replied. The irony is quite profound. She's protecting roughly $2 million in spa business assets from someone who now controls nearly 20 times that amount. The mathematical reality of the situation would have been amusing if it weren't so revealing about the fundamental assumptions underlying their marriage. Meanwhile, Simone was receiving her own revelations 3 miles away in Marcus Thompson's office, where the investigator's report painted a picture that confused more than it clarified. Your husband isn't having an affair, Marcus stated definitively, sliding a folder across his desk. I've monitored his activities for 2 weeks, and his behavior is entirely consistent with someone managing significant financial or legal matters. The photographs showed Jerome entering and leaving Harold Pemberton's law office, the same prestigious firm that handled estate planning for some of Atlanta's most prominent families. The bank account you discovered is legitimate, funded by what appears to be inheritance distributions from a trust that's been managed by Pemberton Associates for several decades. Simone studied the surveillance photos with growing bewilderment, trying to reconcile this information with her assumptions about Jerome's financial situation. But how is that possible, she asked, her voice carrying the confusion of someone whose carefully constructed understanding of reality was shifting beneath her feet. Jerome's an architect. He's never mentioned in any family money or inheritance prospects. Marcus leaned back in his chair with the patient expression of someone accustomed to delivering unexpected information to clients who had prepared themselves for entirely different revelations. Wealthy families often maintain privacy about their assets for generations, he explained. Your husband may have legitimate reasons for discretion that have nothing to do with deception or infidelity. The investigator's words forced Simone to confront an uncomfortable possibility. She had hired someone to investigate her husband based on assumptions that might have been completely wrong. Her business instincts, usually so reliable, had led her to interpret Jerome's behavior through the lens of potential threat rather than considering alternative explanations. What kind of inheritance are we discussing, she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Marcus consulted his notes before responding with characteristic precision. Based on the financial activity I've observed, we're likely talking about substantial assets, possibly in the millions. The legal meetings, the bank transfers, the careful timing, all of it suggests your husband recently came into significant wealth. Jerome's phone rang as he left Harold's office, Simone's name appearing on the caller display with timing that felt almost cosmic in its irony. We need to talk. Her voice carried an urgency that hadn't been present during their confrontation the previous evening, and Jerome realized that her investigation had probably yielded results she hadn't expected. About what specifically, he asked, though he could guess the direction their conversation would take. Her investigation had likely uncovered enough information to make her realize she had been operating under false assumptions, though he doubted she yet understood the full scope of what she had discovered. About the things you've been hiding from me, she replied, her tone carrying confusion rather than the anger he had expected. I think we both have some explaining to do. As Jerome walked toward his car, he reflected on his grandfather's wisdom about timing and revelation. Ezra had understood that truth possessed its own momentum, that secrets revealed themselves when the moment was right, rather than when people demanded disclosure. The prenuptial agreement that had seemed so important to Simone just weeks earlier was about to become a meaningless piece of paper, not because it was legally invalid, but because the assumptions underlying it had been fundamentally incorrect from the beginning. Jerome started the engine and headed home, knowing that the conversation awaiting him would either strengthen their marriage through honest communication or confirm that their relationship had been built on foundations too weak to support the weight of complete truth. The living room felt different when Jerome returned home that evening, as if the very air had been charged with the electricity of impending revelation. Simone stood by the bay windows overlooking the gardens his grandfather had designed, her silhouette framed against the dying light of what had been a day of discoveries for both of them. She turned as he entered, and Jerome could see that Marcus Thompson's report had shaken her assumptions as thoroughly as Harold Pemberton's documents had confirmed his inheritance. I owe you an apology, she said without preamble, her voice carrying a vulnerability he hadn't heard in months. I hired a private investigator to follow you, and I was wrong about everything I thought you were hiding. The admission hung between them like a bridge. Neither was certain they should cross, representing either the beginning of honest communication or the final acknowledgement that their marriage had deteriorated beyond repair. Jerome set his briefcase down carefully, studying his wife's face for signs of the woman he had fallen in love with 5 years earlier. What did your investigator tell you? He asked, though he could already guess the general outline of Marcus Thompson's findings. Simone's spite business had taught her to read people's emotions with professional precision, but Jerome could see that she was struggling to interpret the complex mixture of hurt, understanding, and ironic amusement in his expression. He said you weren't having an affair, she replied, moving away from the window toward the center of the room where they could face each other directly. He said you have been meeting with estate lawyers about what appears to be a significant inheritance. The words came out hesitantly, as if she were testing a foreign language she wasn't certain she spoke fluently. And how did that make you feel? Jerome asked, settling into the armchair that had been his grandfather's favorite, the leather worn smooth by decades of evening conversations about business, relationships, and the responsibilities that came with wealth. Simone's composure wavered as she recognized the deeper question beneath his seemingly simple inquiry. Confused, she admitted, her successful businesswoman facade cracking to reveal genuine uncertainty. Ashamed that I jumped to conclusions instead of talking to you directly, and worried about what this means for us. She paused, studying his face for clues about his emotional state. Jerome, if you've inherited money, why didn't you tell me? We're supposed to be partners in everything. The question Jerome had been dreading finally lay before them, requiring an honesty that would either rebuild their marriage or confirm its fundamental weakness. Because I wanted to see how you would treat me when you thought I had nothing, he said quietly, his grandfather's wisdom echoing in every word. Ezra taught me that money reveals people's true character rather than changing it. Your prenuptial agreement, your sudden concern about protecting your assets, your willingness to hire an investigator rather than have a direct conversation, all of that showed me something about our relationship that I needed to understand. Simone's face went through a series of expressions as she processed the implications of his words, and Jerome could see the exact moment when she realized how her actions had appeared from his perspective. "You think I married you for financial security," Simone said, her voice barely above a whisper as the full weight of his accusations settled over her. "You think the prenup was about greed rather than protection." Jerome's silence was answer enough, and she felt something inside her chest tighten as she confronted the possibility that her husband had been testing her for months without her knowledge. "How much money are we talking about, Jerome?" she asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to know the answer that would put her own assets into stark perspective. "Enough to make your spa business look like pocket change," he replied with brutal honesty. 20 million, give or take a few million depending on market conditions. The number hit her like a physical blow, not because of its magnitude, but because of what it revealed about the depth of his deception. $20 million, Simone repeated, sinking into the sofa as she struggled to process the information. "You've been sitting there watching me worry about protecting $2 million in spa assets from someone who controls 10 times that amount." The absurdity of the situation would have been laughable if it hadn't been so devastating to everything she thought she understood about their marriage. "You let me look like a greedy fool," she continued, her voice rising as anger began to overwhelm her initial shame. "You let me present that prenup like I was protecting myself from some kind of financial predator, when you knew the whole time that you could buy my entire business without affecting your monthly budget." The hurt in her voice was genuine, but Jerome could hear undertones of something else. Wounded pride, perhaps, or the recognition that she had been outmaneuvered in a game she hadn't known she was playing. "I let you reveal who you really are when you thought you had the upper hand," Jerome corrected, his own anger finally breaking through the calm facade he had maintained for months. "You didn't trust me enough to have an honest conversation about your concerns. You hired someone to investigate me like I was a criminal rather than your husband. And when you thought you needed to protect your assets, your first instinct was to create legal barriers between us rather than work together toward mutual security." Each accusation landed with precision, and Simone realized that while she had been focused on protecting her business, Jerome had been conducting a much more sophisticated evaluation of their entire relationship. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice small in the face of revelations that had turned their marriage inside out. Jerome looked around the room that had witnessed 3 generations of his family's conversations about love, money, and the delicate balance between them. "Now we decide whether we want to be married to each other or just to the lifestyle we've created together," he said with the finality of someone who had given considerable thought to their options. "Because this conversation has shown me that we've been living as business partners who share a bed, not as people who genuinely care about each other's happiness and well-being." The truth of his assessment settled over them both, and Simone realized that the inheritance was only part of what had been revealed. Their marriage had been tested in ways she was only beginning to understand, and they had both discovered things about themselves and each other that couldn't be undone by apologies or explanations. The silence that followed Jerome's ultimatum stretched between them like a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge, and Simone found herself unable to formulate a response that wouldn't sound like either justification or surrender. The weight of revelation had transformed their familiar living room into foreign territory, where every piece of furniture carried memories that now felt tainted by misunderstanding and concealed motives. "I need some time to think," she said finally, her voice barely steady as she gathered her purse and keys with movements that felt disconnected from conscious decision. Jerome nodded without surprise, recognizing in her retreat the same strategic withdrawal she used in business when faced with problems that required careful analysis rather than immediate reaction. The sound of her car leaving the driveway left him alone in the house that had been his grandfather's greatest gift, though at the moment it felt more like an elaborate monument to his own miscalculation. Simone drove aimlessly through Atlanta's evening traffic before eventually parking outside her flagship spa location, the building that represented 15 years of careful planning, calculated risks, and relentless determination to build something lasting and valuable. The familiar scent of eucalyptus and lavender greeted her as she used her key to enter the darkened reception area. But even this sanctuary felt different now that she understood how small her achievements appeared when measured against Jerome's inherited wealth. She settled into her office chair and stared at the financial projections that had seemed so important just hours earlier, wondering when she had become the kind of person who valued security over trust and control over vulnerability. Her reflection in the darkened window showed a successful businesswoman who had somehow lost sight of what success was supposed to provide, not just financial independence, but the freedom to love and be loved without calculating the cost and benefits. The spa's silence amplified her thoughts as she confronted the uncomfortable possibility that Jerome's accusations contained more truth than she wanted to acknowledge. When had she begun viewing their marriage through the lens of asset protection rather than emotional partnership? The prenuptial agreement had seemed like practical wisdom when she drafted it, but Jerome's revelation cast it in a different light, as evidence that she had never truly trusted him, never believed that his love for her transcended financial considerations. "But he was testing me," she said aloud to the empty office, her voice echoing off the walls lined with certificates and awards that suddenly felt like hollow achievements. "He watched me make a fool of myself instead of being honest about what he inherited." The justification felt weak even as she spoke it, because she recognized that her actions had revealed something about her character that couldn't be excused by his deception. Meanwhile, Jerome sat in his grandfather's study, surrounded by the books and mementos that had shaped 3 generations of William's men, trying to understand where his careful observation had become cruel manipulation. Ezra's letter lay open on the desk before him, its words about money revealing true character seeming less wise now than they had that morning in Harold's office. "Watch how people treat you when they believe you have nothing," his grandfather had written. But perhaps there was a difference between patient observation and deliberate deception that the old man hadn't fully considered. Jerome poured himself a glass of the bourbon Ezra had favored, tasting the smoky complexity that reminded him of evening conversations about business ethics and the moral obligations that came with inherited advantages. Had he honored his grandfather's wisdom, or had he twisted it into justification for testing his wife in ways that no marriage should have to endure? The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight as Jerome finally admitted to himself that Simone's anger was at least partially justified. Yes, her actions had revealed concerning patterns in how she approached their relationship, but his concealment had created the very circumstances that brought out her worst impulses. A woman who had built her business empire through careful planning and risk mitigation couldn't be expected to ignore suspicious financial activity without seeking answers, especially when her husband deflected direct questions with evasive responses. "Maybe we were both wrong," he said to Ezra's portrait, which seemed to regard him with the patient expression of someone who had made his own share of relationship mistakes. "Maybe the test was unfair because I stacked the deck against her from the beginning." 3 days passed before Simone returned, her absence filled with the kind of introspection that only came when forced to confront fundamental assumptions about oneself. She found Jerome exactly where she had left him, though the study now showed signs of prolonged occupancy, coffee cups, legal documents, and what appeared to be multiple drafts of a letter that began "My dear Simone" in his careful handwriting. "I've been thinking," she said from the doorway, her voice carrying a different quality than it had during their confrontation, "about what kind of person I've become, and whether that's someone I actually want to be." Jerome looked up from his writing with eyes that reflected the same kind of soul-searching weariness she felt, and she realized that their separation had been as difficult for him as it had been for her. "I've been thinking too," Jerome replied, setting aside his pen and giving her his complete attention in a way that reminded her of their early courtship when every conversation felt like a discovery. "About whether testing you was fair, or if I created a situation where you couldn't succeed no matter what you did." His admission surprised her. She had expected either continued anger or defensive justification, not this vulnerable acknowledgement of shared responsibility for their crisis. "The truth is, Simone, I was so focused on protecting myself from being loved for my money that I forgot to consider whether I was being lovable as myself." The honesty in his voice created space for the kind of conversation they should have had months earlier, before distrust and hidden agendas had poisoned their ability to communicate openly. Simone entered the study fully, taking the chair across from his desk that had once belonged to his grandmother. a detail he had shared during happier times when family history felt like interesting background rather than relevant context for understanding his behavior. "I realized something while I was away," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I've been so afraid of being vulnerable that I turned our marriage into a business arrangement. The prenup wasn't really about protecting my assets. It was about protecting myself from the possibility that you might leave and take my sense of security with you." The admission felt like removing armor she had worn for so long she had forgotten the weight of it, exposing fears that went deeper than financial concerns to touch on fundamental questions about her worthiness of unconditional love. Jerome reached across the desk and took Simone's hand, a gesture that carried the tentative quality of two people learning to trust each other again after discovering how far they had drifted apart. "We've both been protecting ourselves from the wrong thing," he said quietly, his thumb tracing the wedding ring that suddenly felt like more than just a symbol. It felt like a promise they had both forgotten how to keep. "I was so afraid you'd love me for my money that I forgot to give you a chance to love me for who I really am. And you were so afraid of being vulnerable that you never let me show you that I could be trusted with your heart." The understanding between them felt fragile, like morning frost that could disappear with the slightest disturbance. But it also carried the potential for something stronger than what they had built before. Simone squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar calluses from his architectural work that reminded her of the man she had fallen in love with before money and fear had complicated everything. "I want to tear up the prenup," she said without hesitation, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Not because it's meaningless now that I know about your inheritance, but because I want to choose trust over protection. I want to choose us over my own security." The words felt like stepping off a cliff, but for the first time in months, falling didn't terrify her because she believed Jerome would catch her. "If we're going to make this work, we have to start over with complete honesty, even when it's uncomfortable." "I've been thinking about that too," Jerome replied, reaching for one of the draft letters he had been working on during their separation. "Harold suggested we could structure some of the inheritance as an investment in your spa expansion, not as charity or pity, but as genuine business partners building something together." He handed her the document, which outlined a plan for taking Serenity Spa Solutions national, using a combination of her business expertise and his newly inherited resources. "It would mean we're not just married people who happen to live together, but actual partners working towards shared goals that matter to both of us." The proposal represented more than financial planning. It was an offer to merge their lives in ways that honored both their individual strengths and their collective potential. Simone read through the business plan with the professional attention she brought to all financial decisions. But underneath her analytical mind, she felt something stirring that had nothing to do with profit margins or expansion strategies. "You've been thinking about this for 3 days?" she asked, looking up at him with an expression that mixed gratitude with amazement. "While I was at the spa feeling sorry for myself, you were figuring out how to turn our disaster into something constructive?" Jerome's nod confirmed what she was beginning to understand. Their crisis had revealed not just their weaknesses, but also their capacity for growth, their ability to learn from mistakes rather than simply repeat them endlessly. Ezra always said that the best partnerships, in business or marriage, come from people who complement each other's strengths rather than competing with each other's insecurities, Jerome explained, settling back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone who had finally found solid ground after months of uncertainty. "You understand business operations and customer relations in ways I never could. I apparently have access to capital and family connections that could help your vision reach its full potential. Together, we might actually build something remarkable." The word "together" carried weight that went beyond their business discussion, encompassing their marriage, their future, and their commitment to choosing partnership over self-protection. Simone folded the business plan carefully, but her eyes remained on Jerome's face as she processed not just his proposal, but the deeper offer it represented. "This isn't going to be easy," she said finally, her voice carrying the realism of someone who had built a successful business by understanding that good intentions weren't enough without sustained effort. "We've spent months treating each other like potential threats instead of chosen partners. Learning to trust again, really trust, is going to take time." Jerome nodded, recognizing the truth in her assessment, while also appreciating that she was willing to do the difficult work their marriage required. "But it's worth trying," he said, and this time it wasn't a question. They sat together in the study that had witnessed 3 generations of Williams family conversations, surrounded by books and memories that suddenly felt like blessings rather than burdens. Outside, the sun was setting over gardens that Ezra had planted with the patience of someone who understood that the best things took time to grow properly. Their marriage would require the same kind of patient cultivation, but for the first time in months, they both believed it could flourish.